All right, so if we're all okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'll make sure and let any latecomers in as we go through. If anyone has any connectivity issues, let us know. My name is Jacqueline Luna. I am the programs manager here at the Coronado Library. We're so excited to partner with the Coronado Historical Association and Vicki over there with this wonderful presentation. Just a couple little housekeeping things. If you could, again, please make sure those microphones are on silent during the presentation. We will have time for Q&A at the end, and you'll be able to unmute yourself at that point to ask any of those questions. This is being recorded, and we will have it up on the library's YouTube video by the end of the week for anyone who would like to revisit it or share this presentation along. But I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Vicki to introduce our wonderful author today.
Thank you, Jacqueline, and thank you to your whole team for always being up for partnering programs. We love working with you guys. As Jacqueline said, my name is Vicki Stone, and I'm the curator of collections for the Coronado Historical Association. And we are really excited to have you join us for today's virtual lecture. This lecture is very timely for us because, as I mentioned to Jacqueline and Mark before we got started, is the Coronado Historical Association has a traveling exhibit called Open Doors, Vietnam POWs 50 Years of Freedom, which takes a close look at former Vietnam POWs through impressionistic photographic portraits and accompanying written profiles. It was produced by photographer Jamie Howren and author Taylor Baldwin Keeland. The exhibit was created in 2003 on the 30th anniversary of the men's return and updated for the 50th anniversary in 2023. And we're excited to announce that five of the Open Doors portraits are going to be on display at San Diego Airport's new Terminal 1 starting later this month and throughout 2026. And a portrait of San Diego resident Doug Hegdahl is one of the portraits that's going to be displayed. So we're really excited about that, and we're going to be announcing more information, including which gate number you can actually see the portraits at coming up soon. So just be sure to follow us on social media to learn more. And with that, I'm really pleased to introduce our speaker for today, journalist and historian Mark Leepson. Mark is the author of 11 books, including four biographies: What So Proudly We Hailed, Francis Scott Key, A Life, Lafayette, Idealist General, The Ballad of the Green Beret, and The Unlikely War Hero. A former staff writer for Congressional Quarterly in Washington, D.C., he has written for many newspapers and magazines, the Encyclopedia Britannica, and has interviewed many times on radio and television, including The Today Show, Discovery Channel, The History Channel, All Things Considered, Morning Edition, and the BBC NewsHour. He is a senior writer, arts editor, and columnist for the VVA Veteran, the magazine published by Vietnam Veterans of America, and taught U.S. history at Laurel Ridge Community College in Warrenton, Virginia. Mark graduated from George Washington University in 1967. After serving in the U.S. Army from 1967 to 69, including a year in the Vietnam War, he received his honorable discharge and went on to earn a master's degree in history from George Washington in 1971. He lives in Virginia, where he joins us from today. And so I want to say thank you, Mark, for being here. We're looking forward to learning more.
Well, great. Thanks a lot, Vicki. By the way, that was a terrific introduction, and thank you for reading it the way I wrote it. So, uh, it's my pleasure to do this. I really appreciate the Coronado Historical and the library for doing this. And especially, since you're Coronado and since Doug has lived in San Diego for all these years, it just seemed appropriate. I wished I could have come out to do a talk there at your building, but I think this is going to work out well. So, I'm going to give you the highlights of this book I wrote called The Unlikely War Hero, which is what we call a slice of life biography of Doug Hegdahl, the youngest and lowest ranking American POW held in the Hanoi Hilton during the Vietnam War. He was a 20-year-old sailor, a seaman apprentice, E2, second lowest rank in the Navy. And you all know, I'm sure, who the other people there in the Hanoi Hilton. They were almost all of them were shot down over North Vietnam. They were primarily Air Force and Navy pilots and navigators and so on. And most of them were at least 5, 10, some 15 years older than Doug. So what happened after he got shot down is an amazing story. It's been out there for a long time, but this book was the first one that tells the whole story. I hope. I mean, I worked on it for 2.5 years, so I think I have most of it. And I'm going to run it by you, and we'll have time for questions at the end. So let's start at the beginning. And Doug is from eastern South Dakota, a little town called Clark, really a dot on the map. It's about a 4 hour drive west of Minneapolis and about a 3 hour drive south of Fargo. It's farming country. Clark got put on the map, a population about 1,500 today. Clark was settled primarily, like most of that area of the country, by Scandinavians, a lot of whom came over here from Norway. In fact, all four of Doug Hegdahl's grandparents came over from Norway in the 1870s and the 1880s. A lot of them were farmers, and you can see this. I love old historical photographs, and this is a real, I think, evocative one of what it was like for a farming family in a sod house, working the land, the two little girls even helping out, and so on. Clark literally got put on the map uh, in the early 1880s when something happened that happened throughout the United States, west of the Mississippi, uh, in the 19th century, and that was the railroad came through, and it still does today. So the railroad goes right down the center of Clark. The little town grew up around it. I found this cool old kind of drawn map of Clark from 1883. And then I have some historical pictures of Clark too. This is probably from the early 20th century. You can see it wasn't exactly a garden spot. I mean, the roads weren't paved. We did have a downtown. And like I said, the population was around the same it was now back then, 12, 1300, 1400. So Doug was born in 1946 in Watertown, which is it's a bigger town nearby. And his parents decided to leave Watertown in the mid 50s and move to Clark and get into the hospitality business. They purchased the old Clark Hotel, which dated back to the 1880s. Here's a picture of it. It wasn't exactly a garden spot either. And Doug and the family lived there. And the boys were expected to help out with chores around. Doug worked summers on the farms. The real name was, as you can see, the Clark Hotel and Motel. The people that I talked to, people Doug grew up with, and the nickname was the Hegdahl Hotel. And then I was talking to one of the guys, one of his friends, and he said, "Oh yeah, we also called it the Hegdahl Hilton." I'm like, "Wait, what?" I mean, a sarcastic because it was anything but the Hilton. So that floored me for a while, and it sort of made things have a nice, you know, beginning, middle, and an end because, of course, where he wound up. So his parents, Edith and oops, I forgot her dad's name, Abe. Edith and Abe. Um, After Doug joined the Navy, they sold the Hegdahl Hilton and they bought this place on the edge of town. I think for those of us in my age bracket, you can remember when they're still out there in places, really no frills, low flung motel, the A&E, Abe and Edith on the outside of town. So Doug grew up in the baby boom years. So there were always lots of kids around his age. In Clark, I got some copies of his high school yearbooks. He went to Clark High School. He was a Clark High School Comet. This is his sophomore year picture. He was a big guy. He was about 6'2", weighed 220. He wrestled heavyweight on the Clark wrestling team. You can see him there. I circled his face. Here's his class of 66 high school yearbook photo. I mean, for those of you in my age bracket, does that look like every kid you went to high school with in the 60s, early mid 60s? There's Doug, and he always wore the glasses. So Doug was graduated in 66, was not going to go to college. He was about to get drafted into the Army. 1966 was the largest draft post World War II. I think 50,000 men got drafted. Maybe it was more. I talked to his parents, and they suggested that he join the Navy so he could at least guarantee that he wouldn't be carrying a rifle in the Vietnam War in the jungle. So they drove up to Watertown. He met with a Navy recruiter, and he signed up to be a postal clerk. And the recruiter asked him, hey, Doug, where do you want to go? He said, Australia. I've never been to Australia. In fact, Doug had never been on the ocean, had crossed an ocean before. And we'll see how close he really got to Australia as time goes on. So he had a delayed enlistment. This was, I think, in October of 66. And he went in, I think, uh, not soon after that, in November. He went to the big, guess what? The U.S. Navy Training Center in San Diego. This is a generic picture from later, but that's just to illustrate what it was. He did not do well in boot camp. Now, Doug was not a dumb guy. He was smart, but he was not motivated. He was a jokester. He liked to screw around, and he was recycled. For those of you who are in the military, know what recycled means in basic training. For those of you who don't, you can't flunk out of basic training or boot camp. If you screw up, if you're getting the hospital, you got to recycle. You got to start all over again, and it doesn't count against your time served. So he's recycled. He finishes boot camp, and then something happened. We don't really know what happened. The postal clerk thing never happened. He hung around San Diego at the base for a couple of months, a couple of weeks, went home for Christmas, came back, still didn't get orders, and finally in February he got shipped out to to Subic Bay in the Philippines, which had this huge, Navy base since World War II. And he was assigned to this ship, the USS Canberra, which was a guided missile cruiser, World War II era. Can you see the guided missiles there? In fact, it was one of the first two Navy ships equipped with guided missiles in the mid 1950s. It did 5 Vietnam War cruises. They never fired a missile in anger, but the ship had these big 6-inch and 8-inch guns, and the Canberra's job was to patrol the South China Sea about 2 or 3 miles off the coast of North and South Vietnam. In those 5 cruises, they went up and down the entire country from down in the Delta all the way up into North Vietnam. And they fired thousands and thousands and thousands of giant shells at targets in North Vietnam and in South Vietnam. They used recon on the ground in South Vietnam and on the air in North Vietnam. The Navy has great photos. I have some great pictures of the big guns firing. Um, Here's another one. This is March 1967. Doug was on the ship then. Oh, he was, like I said, postal clerk never happened. He became a member of the deck crew. The deck crew in the Navy are the guys and these days women who do the scut work. They clean the little latrines. The heads. I was in the Army, so sometimes I slip into Army talk. So if there's Navy people in the audience, feel free to correct me later. But so the heads, they paint everything that doesn't move. They swab the decks. Doug's job was an ammo humper, an ammunition handler. It was a rough job. They did like 12-hour shifts. Shifts. They spent a lot of time below decks. They also pulled a lot of guard duty, as we called it in the Army. And there was also like 6 hours on, or 4 hours on, 2 hours off. And sometimes they didn't know whether it was day or night, the deck crew. And Doug hated it. The captain at the time was Ed Rosenberg. That's him on the left. And, he's not around. But I read a lot about Rosenberg, and I talked to 3 of his junior officers who served on board ship. They didn't like him. They think he just was trigger happy. He was always ordering multiple bombardment. In fact, the reason that the Canberra was in Subic Bay was they had, I don't know, the previous month they had fired, this is back in February, 10,000 shells, and the guns had to be rebored. So that's Ed Rosenberg. Oh, here's a shot at night. And this goes directly into what happened to Doug, because as Doug tells it, the the guy said, "Hey, if you haven't seen those big guns firing at night, it's quite a sight." So he was restless one night. This was April 6, 1967. He was only on the ship for 2 months. And so he got out of his bunk. He didn't even take his glasses. He went up on the deck, and as you can see, that the deck up there, it's a teak wood deck, and it's pretty narrow. And the guns were firing. It was about 4:30 in the morning, and the next thing he knew, he said he was in the South China Sea. He says he does not remember how it happened. He's testified before Congress. They asked him. He doesn't remember what happened. No one saw it, so we have to take his word for it. Um, we can narrow things down pretty well about what time it happened. This is a of the deck log. So the Navy's records, all the deck logs, which is the minute by minute happenings on board, are were written down by hand by an officer of the deck. And you can see where I circled 4:15. That's when the firing started. And then 4:42 is when the firing ceased. So we know that he went overboard on that time. The crew mustered the next morning, April 7th, at 7:40 a.m. And you know what? Absentees, none. There was a screw up. They just counted everybody there. But there was a second muster at 11:30. You can see what I circled on the bottom. And Doug was reported missing and presumed overboard after they did a search of the ship. Now, as far as another search was concerned, everybody I talked to who was on that ship does not remember. Well, what they do remember and what the ship logs bear out is that Ed Rosenberg took off. He had work to do. He went and got the ship out of there. No one remembers any planes looking for Doug. Just two searches of the ship. And so Doug's account of what happened is that he was in the water. He saw the ship going the other way. He was a couple, 3 miles offshore. He knew he couldn't make it there. So he was treading water for at least 2 hours, maybe 3 hours. And he was about to go down when he looked up and he saw a rudimentary fishing boat. And he waved his arms and they saw him. So Doug says, and they picked him up out of the water. Doug says that of all the of all the POWs in the Hanoi Hilton, he was the only one who was not captured. He was rescued. So they did save his life. They treated him well. They gave him some dry clothes and some food, but then they took him to shore and they turned him over to the militia and they roughed him up a little bit. The villagers weren't happy to see this guy. And then they took his shoes off, blindfolded him, put him in a truck, and shipped him off to the Hanoi Hilton. Um, and let's talk a little bit about the Hanoi Hilton, aka the Devil's Island of the Far East. This is an aerial of it. So the Hanoi Hilton was a former French prison called Maison Centrale. This is a current day picture of it. It's now a museum. And this is where this was from the 19th century when the French had, been in charge, colonialized Vietnam, all of Southeast Asia, Laos, Cambodia. And there were incipient revolts, and anytime they suspected anybody or found anybody, they threw them in there. It was a horrendous place. Here's some pictures. Well, before I go into that, when we say the Hanoi Hilton, we're talking about the Maison Centrale, which the Vietnamese name was Hoa Lo, Hoalo. There were, as more and more Americans were taken prisoner in North Vietnam, the North Vietnamese set up a series of other POW camps. So some of them were in Hanoi, and you can see here on the map, some of them were outside of Hanoi. They have the American nicknames for some of them. The three most popular, well, the four most populated were Wallow, Hanoi Hilton, the Zoo, Alcatraz, and the Plantation. And the prisoners gave them those nicknames because, like the zoo, it used to be, farm animals used to be there. The Plantation was like the colonial mayor of Hanoi's house and the surrounding property. So here's some pictures inside the Wallow prison. Can you see what's down at the end of the the hallway there, the guillotine. The French did use it against the Vietnamese, but they did not use it against the Americans. However, there was a lot of torture going on there, and we'll get to that in a minute. I have some other pictures from the time. Some of these probably were staged. This one was later on in the war, and so was this one, which was colorized. In fact, they used that on the cover of the book. Um, so, like I said, Doug was the youngest POW in the Hanoi Hilton by far, and the lowest ranking by far. And just to give you an example of who else was in there, I have a few picked out people you may have heard of. Everett Alvarez is one. He was one of the first. He was one of the first. He was the first American pilot shot down over Hanoi and taken prisoner. And he was held to the duration from August 5th, 1964 to 73 when all the POWs were released. That's Alvarez in his Navy uniform as a prisoner and when he came home. There was Bob Schumacher, who was the second pilot shot down, who also was held till 73. Uh, he is credited with thinking up the nickname Hanoi Hilton, the sarcastic nickname that stuck. You might remember Jeremiah Denton. He was Naval Academy class of 1947. Doug was born a year before that. So just to show you the age difference. And he was one of the resistors. And he was tortured. And you can see pictures of him. This was a Japanese film crew that came in to ask him questions, and that's him on the when he came home. You probably remember James Stockdale, Admiral Stockdale, U.S. Naval Academy 46, the year Doug was born. He was for most of the time, the de facto, they had a de facto chain of command behind bars, and he was the commanding officer for most of that time, tortured mercilessly, one of the big resistors. You can see that picture that they released um, of him on the left, and that's him coming home with two of his sons. And you see him there with a Medal of Honor around his neck. He received the Medal of Honor for his courageous actions under fire, in the prison. And of course, I'm sure most everybody knows John McCain, Naval Academy class of 58, shot down in the lake of Hanoi. There's a picture of it. He was in very, very terrible condition. His back was broken. I read memoirs of two of the guys that they threw him in with when he got there, and they had to attend to all of his bodily needs for almost a year. He was in that bad condition. He did survive. And I think too, that his father was Admiral McCain, who was the commander in chief of U.S. naval forces in the Pacific. And the Vietnamese knew that. That's why they show this picture. And that's why, they trumpeted the fact that they had John McCain. You can see here, this is the picture when he was released. You can tell by the way he's walking, his back was still not great. So, and then but well, no, Dick Stratton also, Dick went to Stanford. He was a high-flying Navy pilot. He was shot down January 5th, a couple months before Doug was. The Vietnamese are always throwing people, the deal when you got there was, you got in front of an interrogator. Oh, I will just tell you, they didn't believe Doug when he told them he fell off his ship. They thought he was a spy. But he convinced them that he was this lowly seaman apprentice, E2, that he did fall off the ship. He was never tortured. I mean, he was put in some pretty bad positions. And he was in solitary later for 9 months, which was hellish. But he wasn't tortured. They kind of left him alone. Not really, but in comparison. So the after you were interrogated, oh, the other thing is Doug never had survival training. But instinctively, he figured out something to buffalo the North Vietnamese. He told these experienced interrogators nothing except fairy tales and acted like the village idiot, like he didn't understand. They asked him to spell Clark, and he said, "I don't know. Could you look it up in a map for me?" He fooled them into thinking that he was low intelligence. He was not. He was dumb like a fox. One interrogator called him the incredibly stupid one. Believe me, he was not stupid, but it was a ploy that worked for his entire time there. He got thrown in with Stratton. So the MO was you get interrogated, then they throw you in with somebody. This was back in 67. It changed a little later. And for no obvious reason. And Doug couldn't believe he was in with Dick Stratton, a lieutenant commander, and Stratton couldn't believe this 20-year-old kid who fell off his ship. But you know what? They bonded. They bonded and they became friends then and after. And the other, so he was sent in. Here's a picture. This is an East German propaganda film. Before Doug went in with Dick, they didn't know each other at the time, but that's them in the community shower. And one other guy I want to tell you about is Joe Krecka, who was an Air Force pilot shot down, and he was there for the duration. Doug went in with Krecka after, I don't know, about 2 months in with Dick. So let me tell you about Doug and what he did. So the conditions were not good. They got two crappy meals a day. They had to wake up with a gong at 5:30 in the morning. They were pulled in for interrogations, and if the Vietnamese didn't like it, they were tortured. I mean, the rope trick, I think you know what that is, and lots of other things, rubber hoses and everything. Men were killed. Men didn't survive some of that. Um, and aside from that, the food being moldy bread with watered down squash soup and not being allowed to communicate verbally on a punishment of torture. You weren't allowed to talk to anybody, except for somebody you were in a cell with. Aside from that, which was horrible, boredom was a big problem. And one of the ways that the guys, tried to fight the boredom was to memorize names. It started because of what happened in Korea when the North Koreans didn't give a really good accounting of who they had. So the word went out from this de facto chain of command to memorize names. And then on the off chance that someone would get home, they could give the names, or if everybody was released, they would at least have a list of names. So people memorized names. And one day Doug was in a cell with Stratton. They were talking about that, and Doug said, I got a pretty good memory. I can recite the Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. And Stratton said, well, who can't? And Doug said, well, you know what? I can recite it backwards. And Stratton said, I don't think so. So Doug said, okay, write down the words so you can check. So the floor was made out of dirt. He got a rock. He wrote it out. And sure enough, Doug recited it backwards. Dick was amazed. He said, you know what? You are going to learn names. And I think you know also that although they were forbidden to communicate, they passed notes when they were in the shower, and they also adopted the tap code, right? A kind of a Morse code because the cells had adjoining walls, and as soon as a new guy came in, you would tap, and they would learn it. So Doug was able to get the names to memorize the names about 120, 140 with Stratton in a couple months he was with him. And by the way, I talked to Dick Stratton a lot. Well, I didn't talk to him. We emailed a lot. He was deaf and he couldn't talk on the phone, but he answered lots of my questions. And he was a tremendous help to me in this book. And he told me that as far as the Gettysburg address story is concerned, that happened. And one day he and his wife Alice were in a car with Doug going somewhere, and they were talking about it. And Doug started laughing. And Dick said, what are you laughing about? He said, well, guess what? Remember when I recited the Gettysburg Address backward? Well, I was looking over your shoulder at the words that you wrote on the bottom of your cell. But the fact is, Doug did have a great memory. And when he got in with Krecka helped him. And you know what? He memorized 246 names, ranks, and services, and any other information he could get a hold of. Because the North Vietnamese couldn't get any value with Doug, they gave him a little more freedom than the other guys. He was allowed out of his cell. I missed a propaganda photo, but it does show him out there sweeping the compound. Guess what Doug did? He adapted the tap code to the broom, and he was communicating to guys, they could see through little slits in their cells. He was communicating information to them with his broom when he was out there. And here's a propaganda picture of Doug, two of them. So, um, before we get to the hunger strike, before that, the North Vietnamese were always offering the men early releases. Little known fact, 12 men took early releases. There was a string attached. You had to sign a paper saying you were a war criminal and denouncing the war. The POWs did not look with favor upon them, and when they talk about it, they always say how they felt about 11 of them, but not Doug, because Doug was ordered to go home. He was the only one. Now, by the way, he refused that order. He refused that order for that very reason, because how he knew the other prisoners looked upon the guys who took early releases. So he refused it. He went about his business. He learned more names. He was out more outside of his cell more than others. He got some intel. By one day, he was sweeping. He was in the plantation. He was sweeping near the entrance. He actually looked and saw the street sign, so he knew the address of it, put that in his memory bank. And then out of character, he complained to a guard when a prisoner in the next cell was caught passing a note, and they threw him um, in solitary. And he reacted by going on a hunger strike. And this is a picture of him after he got out. He probably lost 30 or 40 pounds. You can see how gaunt he was. Um, he They gave him glasses after that too. That was one of the things he went on a hunger strike for. This is another picture of him after he got out. So I'm leaving a lot out here, but it's all in the book. But basically, these are the highlights. Early in 1969, the Vietnamese offered to let him out again, and by the way, Stratton had ordered him to accept an early release. He even refused. He ordered him again, and this time Doug did. So they took him, they fed him, they fattened him up, is the way Doug said it, and they sent him home with these two guys, Wes Rumble and Bob Frischman, who Frischman had crash landed and broken his elbow, and he lost one of his elbows. He was in terrible physical shape, hardly ever got out of his cell. Rumble also was hurt and also was sick. So the three of them got an early release in um, August, August 7th, I think it was. We'll get to it in 1969. The way the Vietnamese did it, they made a propaganda show of it. They turned them over to anti-war protesters who came from America in a ceremony, and they invited the communist press and so on and so forth. So on August 5th, that's what it was. They put them on a plane to Vientiane, Laos, and they were released to the U.S. ambassador to Laos. And this is Rumble, Frischman, and Doug on the tarmac right after they got off the plane facing the media. Doug's talking, but Frischman actually did most of the talking. Doug didn't say much. They were taken to the ambassador's office. They were given new clothes, good food. They were allowed to call, or however they did it back then, their families back home. Then they got on a Thai air flight to Bangkok, Thailand, and this is them coming off the flight in Bangkok. Again, they went to the ambassador's office. They were debriefed there. Doug did not let on about the names at that point. Then they got on a Pan Am flight, I think it was, to the States. They stopped over in Frankfurt, Germany, got new uniforms. They all got promoted. And this is Doug with his new Navy uniform. And this is them on arrival the next day, August 7th at Kennedy Airport. That's Edith. They flew in the families. That's Edith and Abe, his mom and dad. This is on a little riser on the tarmac after they got off the airplane. They're facing the press. And that's Frischman's wife. Again, Frischman did most of the talking. Doug just, you can see him looking happy, but he didn't say much. A Rumble had to be taken off the plane on a stretcher. He was Air Force. They shipped him off to an Air Force hospital, and he was out of the picture after getting debriefed and checked out in California. Doug and Frischman, who were in the Navy, were taken to Bethesda Naval Hospital, which is still there. And they had a room for him way up on one of the top floors where they were there for a month getting debriefed and checked out physically and emotionally. And this is when Doug told the debriefer, this is when he recited the 254 names. It's so fast that the debriefer told him to stop so he could tape record him. And he did. And, long story short, now we did have intel on names. We got some from letters home. There was some espionage, and we had an idea. But when intelligence cross-checked the names that Doug gave, 63 men were changed from missing in action to prisoner of war. You know how big that was? 63 families were immediately notified that their husband, father, uncle, brother was alive, and they didn't know. So, and Doug also gave information about torture. That was the first time, Frischman did too. That was the first time that the Pentagon had got firsthand information about what actually was happening in the Hanoi Hilton. So let's just take a step back and look at the bigger picture a little bit, because you know what the number one issue in the Vietnam War was? In within 2 months after Nixon took office in January 1969, the POW issue. The Johnson administration did not want to deal with the POW issue. They were trying to work on peace talks that were trying to get started in Paris. They thought it was a distraction. Nixon went the other way. He started what they called the Going Public campaign, and this is Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird announcing it in May of 1969. So the Nixon administration put on a full court press to try to improve the conditions and get the North Vietnamese to allow like International Red Cross to come in, which they didn't. There's Nixon and Laird talking about it. Now back to Frischman and Doug. They had a press conference on September 2nd after they were finished at Bethesda Naval, in which again, Frischman did most of the talking, Doug did a little. But this was where the American public first found out the extent of the horrible conditions, the torture, the horrible food, all the conditions in Hanoi. And you know what also happened that day? Ho Chi Minh died. If you don't know who Ho Chi Minh was, he was like the George Washington of Vietnam and the current president. He had been leading Revolutionary War, a revolutionary since the World War One, since the end of World War One, and he was the president of North Vietnam. And you know what? After he died, there was a change in the Politburo, the Nixon campaign of going public, and the information that Doug and Frischman gave about the conditions for the first time. There was a marked change in the conditions in the Hanoi Hilton. And we know this. Every POW who wrote a memoir has written about it. I read Jim Stockdale's debriefing. Look, the torture didn't stop, but things changed. By the end of 1969, they got 3 meals a day. They got 5 cigarettes instead of 3. Torture all but ended. They were allowed to communicate with each other. So Doug had an impact on that. It wasn't the only thing. This is the bigger picture of it. So after Bethesda, they let Doug go home. They gave him I was going to say ticker tape. They didn't have ticker tape in Clark, South Dakota, but they gave him a parade right through the middle of town. There's Edith and Abe in the back of a Cadillac convertible, and they had a big celebration at Clark High in the auditorium. The whole town showed up, about 500 people. I talked to a couple of Doug's buddies who were with him during that time. And you know what they told me? Despite this picture, despite Doug grinning here, he was very, very uncomfortable being in the spotlight. The military sent a minder with him who followed him around when he was in Clark. Um, God knows why. But well, one thing is the name thing wasn't made public for another year, but still. And this one of Doug's friends told me that he slipped the minder one night, and he went out to some dive outside of town, and they drank beer. This isn't a picture of that, but it's a picture one of his classmates posted on Facebook that I stole with Doug about that time. And the guy said, you know what? He didn't talk about the Hanoi Hill. He didn't talk about the names. He talked about great times at Clark High and how much fun it was being with his buddies. So the Navy sent him and Frischman after this leave around the country to Navy bases where he met with POW families, and that was good. But Doug was tired of being in the public eye. Um, Here's a little bit more about Nixon, who I think embraced the POW wives. Johnson didn't. It was a 180, and that's Sybil Stockdale, who started the National League of Families, the wives group. Then another player stepped into the scene, and that was Ross Perot. I think you probably know Ross Perot, the Texas he was billionaire. He started something called United We Stand, and he publicized the plight of the POWs by taking ads in newspapers. He did two things also. He chartered a plane. This is in December of 69 with all this food and clothing, and he wanted to give it to the North Vietnamese people as a gesture, but he never got outside of Vientiane, Laos. The Vietnamese said, no, you can't come. He also brought 94 POW wives and 58 women and their children, put them on a plane on Christmas Day, went to Paris to try to talk to the North Vietnamese at the Paris peace talks. Again, they did see three of the women, but they gave them the same old propaganda and they went home empty-handed. There was a big rally in May of 70 at the Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C. Doug spoke. It was chaired by Perot, Sybil Stockdale. You can see Senator Bob Dole in both of those pictures. Um, there were rallies all over the country. This was the number one issue. Doug spoke at them, but he hated doing it. And there were mock-ups of POW cells that Perot wanted to put all over the country, and a few were. There was one in the basement of Congress. And you know what? Perot asked Doug to go to Hanoi and talk to the North Vietnamese about what was going on and see if he could improve conditions. He agreed, and he flew over there with a couple of Perot's people. And one of his friends told me that Doug was not happy because the Perot people went first class and Doug was back there in economy. But he was in Hanoi, in Paris. He got to see the North Vietnamese twice, but they would not do anything but give him the same propaganda. And it made the papers. Hegdahl returns from Paris, all five requests. They were like, let International Red Cross come in, let him have more food, better conditions, and so on. So POW was big. Remember the POW bracelets? That came out during this time. The POW MAI flag, which still flies over government buildings, came out at this time. Doug was sick of it all, sick of being the spotlight. And, he got an early out in July of 70. And here's a picture of Stratton after he got out. Like I said, that he didn't get out till 73. And they were close. This is with him and Dick and Alice in 73 after Dick got back. He moved to San Diego. And you know what? He moved in with Sybil Stockdale. Jim Stockdale was still in Hanoi. She took him in. He lived in the basement. I talked to one of the Stockdale boys. They said Doug was great. He was funny. He took me to Little League games. He was terrific. And then Sybil found him an apartment. And then he bought a house in San Diego because one of his friends told me that, the POW's checks came home to the families when they were held. One of his friend's father was a banker. He invested Doug's money for him, and he was able to buy this house in San Diego. And then just a couple more pictures of the Strattons. And then guess what? He got a job. We don't know how, but we think it had the Stockdales intervened at the Sears School at Coronado, and he was there for 30 years. And he turned out to be a great instructor, a great survival instructor. I talked to people well, actually, several people who came to my talk since the book came out said, "Hey, I had Doug as an instructor. The guy was great." And I read a couple of other accounts too. By the way, that's now called the Stockdale Survival School. There's Jim. They're both gone now, and Sybil. This is his retirement. There's Jim Stockdale, and there's Doug with the shades kneeling down. So Doug went into I'm near the end here. So Doug went into a shell, after he moved to San Diego, especially after he retired. He did appear briefly in a couple of documentaries in the early 2000s, but since then he has not spoken in public. He is not, he's just hermited up there. And he did not speak to me for the book. I went through Stratton, who loved the idea of the book, pitched it to Doug, said no. But he's told Dick, you can help this guy out. So last thing I want to say to you is, the book is called The Unlikely War Hero, and I don't use the word hero lightly, okay? I get sometimes tired of everybody calling all of us who put on a uniform and went over to that war or served anywhere else a hero. I did it. I'm no hero. I did what I had to do when I came home. But Doug was a true hero. And the last thing I'll say to you is that what I believe that this man performed one of the most heroic acts outside of combat in the Vietnam War. What he did, standing up to those, experienced interrogators who could have held the power of life and death over him and all the other POWs, and fooling them like that, and then coming home with all those names, getting 63 families, all this great news, and having a part in changing the conditions for the POWs. So that's why I call the book The Unlikely War Hero. And thank you very much for asking me to do this talk.
Thank you so much, Mark.
Please.
I'm gonna jump
You will.
in and remind everybody, and Jacqueline can let us all know the best way to do this too. But we'd love to open it up for questions. If anybody has anything they'd like to ask Mark, you can go ahead and unmute yourself, or Jacqueline might know the. I don't do Zoom a lot, so I think there is a raise the hand. Oh, let's see. We already have some people, so. Um, let's see. I see Bruce has a hand up. Um,
It looks
Yeah,
like Bruce and Jack both have their hands up right now.
oh, perfect.
just a
Thank
short,
you.
just a short factual question, Mr. Leibson. I was reading in Wiki this morning, and they've got it listed as a 5-inch gun off the ship he was on, causing him to be in the water. Can you, through your channels, have it corrected to 6 or 8-inch guns?
Yeah, I think I misspoke. There were 5 and 8 inch guns, and I'm thinking it was a 5 inch gun
This
that was
June.
firing.
Yes.
Yeah. And by the way, nobody knows what happened. And you know the word scuttlebutt, right? When I talked to 27 sailors. They had 27 different theories. I'm kidding, but there was people say people say that he was pushed, he got into a fight. People say he jumped over. No one really knows. The even so the his official debriefer his official debriefer concluded that something happened with the ship, that the guns and the concussion and the ship may be turning because that deck was narrow there. But, you know, it did have something to do with the guns, or it may not have, but most likely it did. Does that help?
Yeah, thanks. I was just being kind of nitpicky with what I saw in Wiki, needing it to be corrected. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, I went over the Wikipedia entry and I corrected a few things.
Good work.
Fantastic. I believe, let's see, do we have another hand up? Jack, go ahead.
I've got a question. In addition to the names and the torture comments when he got out, was he able to shed any light on the out camps, the ones outside of the city of Hanoi, either by talking to fellow prisoners who said, "Yeah, I was on a truck for about 20 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever," but some of the out POW compounds?
Yes and no. He was, he got moved around too. So he was in the plantation most of the time. I think most of the information that he gave was about the plantation and Wallow. They did move him around, but when they got to the new guy village, they called it, they were blindfolded. They were blindfolded when they went there. Then they interrogated them. Then they blindfolded him again, put him in the back of a truck and took him to the next place. So The answer is yes, but not at, there were 15, I think, camps. So that was the extent of it, I think.
Thank you. What I was getting at actually was the Sante prison, because
Yeah.
about a year after he was let out, the Sante prison operation went down, Operation Kingpin. And so that's what I was getting at.
Yeah, I think, and this is an educated guess, that the intel that we had was not from Doug about Sante.
I understand that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've actually been in the Hanoi Hilton twice. I was
Yeah.
stationed in Hanoi in 1992-93. I created the POWMIA detachment there that's still there now. And so I got to meet some of the interrogators that Doug Hegdahl unfortunately had interaction with.
Wow. Which ones do you remember? Their
Yeah,
names?
the most famous was the rabbit.
The rabbit. Yeah.
Yeah, his name was Senior Colonel E. Ming, but he went by the rabbit. That's what
Yeah.
they called him.
Yeah. They nicknamed all of the interrogators and the camps.
Marvelous. It looks like Dr. John Sexton, if you wanted to go next.
Yes, please. Mark, I worked with Doug for several years in the mid to late 80s at Sears School. And I can tell you that when he was up in front of the group of those who were at high risk of capture, the students at Sears School, he was amazing and spoke very much as you described his experience. And he had the students captivated, many of them aviators. He was very much loved and respected.
Well, thanks for confirming that. That's exactly what I heard. Did he ever talk about what happened to him as far as falling off the ship?
Oh, yes, that was how he started his presentation. And and people really got a kick out of it, so to speak. And but yeah, he talked about his nickname of the incredible stupid one, and yeah, he was quite a guy. I've lost contact with him. I know he was having some trouble.
Yeah. Well, you're not the only one, really. It's just one of those, yeah.
All right, it does look like we have another question here. Ray, if you'd like to go.
Sure. Hey, Mark, are you working on a new book?
I have an idea for a new book. This book came out in December of 24, so almost a year ago. Yeah. And I spent a lot of time marketing this book, doing talks like this, which I love to do, probably too much. But I have an idea. I don't like to talk about my ideas until they come to fruition. But thank you for it's a slice of life biography. How's that?
Sounds good.
Thanks.
All right, looks like Susan has a question. Go ahead, Susan.
I was just curious if he talked about, if he started his talks at this school about what happened when he left the ship. What did he say?
Yeah, what did he say? Did he say he didn't remember and the next thing you knew he was in the water?
Maybe he left already. No?
Oh,
No, how can I? Can you hear me now?
yeah.
Uh, yeah, he had admitted that he finally put it together that it was the big guns firing that blew him off the side. Um, and yeah, it was that story he, like I mentioned, started most every presentation with. We traveled around to several naval air stations for a few years to speak with those who had completed basic SEER training. We called it the Advanced SEER Seminar. And I was into the issue of how to survive captivity. Um, you might know that when you are a captive, you are required to give name, rank, service number, and date of birth. And you are to resist giving any other information to the utmost of your ability. Well, Doug was a great speaker in addressing the issue of how one could reach the utmost of their ability rather quickly with the torture methods that were used. And I have a hunch that while Doug was never very open and honest with things, he did quite a service to the United States.
Do we have any other questions? If anyone wants to raise their hand or let us know. All right. Well, honestly, thank you, Mark, so much for all of this. Vicki, do you have anything you'd like to add before we wrap up here?
No, we appreciate your time and expertise, and I'm looking forward to reading the book.
Okay, there will be a quiz.
All right. Thank you, everyone, so very much for joining us. As a reminder, this has been recorded and we'll have it up on the library's YouTube page within a couple days. All right. I hope everyone
Bye,
has a wonderful
everybody.
rest of your
Thanks.
day.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
You all were great.